Here, you know? Well, now that Liv has raised so many expectations, I hope I don't disappoint you all. But, you know, they always say that hindsight is very useful in telling you where you went wrong. And I think today we have the benefit of 20 years almost of democracy. And there is a lot of hindsight for us to stop and reflect on what we sought to achieve, where we went wrong, and how do we fix up the problem. And I think I go back to this point that ultimately, you know, the real engine of social or political or economic transformation has to be the role of people. And, but people who are unorganized can lead the outcomes to something that is pretty dangerous and very fragile in a society that fails. I think that's what, Liv, you were reflecting on. So people themselves are the agent of change, but it really depends on what their outlook is, what their vision is, what their strategy is, and more fundamentally, what their organization they are that has led such changes. And so I stand here today, and I'm trying to reflect on that, not just in relation to South Africa, but in relation to the world. You know, today is 6 months to the date that in Bangladesh we had what is described as the Rana Square catastrophe. You know, literally, 1,167 people died when a building that that housed many different factories that were producing garments collapsed. And I went there. I went there to pay my respects to the workers. I went and visited workers who had suffered terrible consequences with arms and legs that had been amputated as a result of that tragedy. And I learned something from what they felt and what they wanted me to communicate to audiences such as yourselves. The garment industry in Bangladesh employs close to 4 million workers. A lot of those factories have moved out of China and relocated production to Bangladesh, primarily because labor was cheap. But the fact that 4 million people were employed, and mainly women, is a consequence of another great development in Bangladesh. Bangladesh today, which is amongst the poorest of countries, today will meet many of their MDG goals. One of those goals is the enrollment of girls in school. And that's the result of a different form of mobilization that took place in Bangladesh. Actually had very little to do with government. And that was the role of organizations like BRAC and the Grameen Bank, which today touch the lives of millions of people across Bangladesh. They are in every village, they are in every slum. And if we want to look at some of the results of the development outcomes in Bangladesh, the reduction of child mortality, the reduction of maternal mortality, the enrollment of girls in school has been a consequence of the actions of organizations that have gone out, organized people, and built up these tools and the knowledge that they need to solve their problems. And out of that enrollment of girls in schools and the rights of women in Bangladesh, many of them came out of that schooling period and sought jobs. They were skilled. So at the point where production was moving out of China and looking for places to relocate, they had the human capacity to produce what was being produced in China. And so, yes, it has positive and negative consequences. One of them is that the average wage of those young women in particular was probably about $1 a day. But they were supplying many of the stores that you find when you walk down your main streets here. And so the question then was, how were they organized? What were their union rights? What were their rights to health and safety? And this building, Rana Square, had been condemned by government as unsafe. But the owner of the building happened to be politically connected, and that was ignored. And the consequence was 1,127 workers died. And so when I went to visit them, they said, Jay, please take this message back to people, particularly in the West, where you have available in your shops clothing that is so cheap, clothing that you can buy one and get one for free. And they said, please convey the message that someone has to pay at the end of the day. And here in Rana Square, workers have paid with their lives. So nothing is for free. And this is what we've got to understand, is that the world we live in is so interconnected. And that what happens in one part of the world will affect what happens in the rest of the world. And so I think that's an important message for us, because I remember when I first came here, 27 years ago, almost exactly the period that Mandela spent in prison. And man, I have never been to a country this cold. And we were completely unprepared for it, In fact, when we arrived here, I was dressed in summer clothing, so I didn't even have a jacket. But what did we find here? I'd been newly elected as the General Secretary of COSATU. In fact, we had no office. I didn't have a single staff member. I just barely opened a bank account. And we have been born into a state of emergency with a very brutal apartheid system staring down at us. We were being attacked by employers across the board, and movements like the tribal movement of Inkatha saw us as an enemy. And so we're here to try and find solidarity. And what we found in Scandinavia is the understanding that of what solidarity was, that you did care. And in fact, you became one of the firmest and most reliable allies we had in fighting our struggle for freedom. And very much what is not understood, it wasn't about money. It was about the moral, the political solidarity you gave us, that in many cases meant the difference between life and death for many of us who were in the trenches of the struggle. And even though we may have had some differences in politics or the nuances relating to international affiliation, to the ICFTU in those days, what really determined the position of workers in the LO was, you were trade unionists, and we will support you. And that was the most important factor in us building our relationships with the Nordic trade union movement, who were one of the biggest supporters of COSATU in those days. And I think we've got to reflect on that. Because even today, I come out of a discussion in Sweden with Swedish civil society and all the parties in the Swedish parliament around Swedish development policy. And what we do know today is that the Nordic countries are one of the few places in the world where there hasn't been a move to cut back on development aid. And it's not because the politicians don't want to do that. It's because the society itself believes in social solidarity, that we do care about what happens in the rest of the world. And yes, we can have a big debate about what is the direction of that development aid, what is the mechanisms of it, is it really promoting democracy and justice? But I don't think there's much of a debate in Scandinavia about the fact that human rights are important. Justice is important. Dignity of people is important. That social solidarity lies at the heart of the world that we want to build. So in spite of all the issues that you face, I think it's important to bear that in mind. What I do know today, and I'm working quite closely with many civil society organizations, Civicus, which is the global civil society movement, but I'm coming out of discussions with the International Trade Union Congress, which is Sharon Burrows, and we're in discussions around how to build linkages between the trade unions and environmental groups like Greenpeace or human rights groups like Amnesty. I think there's a very interesting dialogue taking place today that I'm really keen to share with you, because I think the issue of development in the world has been, in a sense, appropriated by people other than social movements. That, in fact, if you want to hear about what's happening in development, there's a lot more discussed in the World Economic Forum than is discussed in civil society. In fact, I'm coming out of a meeting recently on climate justice. And we had, as people invited from civil society around the table, the head of the slum dwellers movement. Now, what we do know is that there's massive migration towards urban areas, that climate change in Africa is having devastating consequences for human well-being, that a large part of the conflict in the Sahel region or in the Horn of Africa has got to do with climate change. And the discussion in those areas, when I went to places like Turkana, is not about carbon emissions. They don't even know what carbon emissions is. What they do know is that there's no water. What they do know is that Lake Chad or Lake Turkana is drying up. The temperature is increasing, and they can't survive on the fish anymore because the fish are dying. The grazing land is gone, and because they're pastoral farmers, a lot of conflict is arising out of that. So we've got to find a way of talking to people about the issues that they feel are important, not that we sitting in places like this feel is important. And I think part of the challenge we face is how to create a narrative that relates to the issues that people feel are important in their day-to-day lives. And if I go back in my mind to our history in South Africa, I'm part of what is called the 1976 generation. We were inspired by Steve Biko. I was 15 years old when I went to go and listen to Steve Biko. And something that he said, clicked the light switch in my head. And he says, you have nothing to lose but your chains. But you've got to liberate your mind first before you can talk about liberating ourselves physically from oppression. It's the oppression of the mind that is so important. And what I found is a channel for the anger I felt. But it channeled and organized my anger towards a political goal of justice. And what he said to us then, and I remember it as clearly as it was yesterday, you have nothing to lose but your change, but you can choose to be a bystander and expect others to fight for you, or you can choose to become a player. And you may die in that process, but at least you died honorable death. It was a very powerful message, So what we turned to was, how do we organize ourselves? And so we rose in our millions in 1976, went onto the streets, and started to build the student movement. And we were smashed. And what was the important lesson out of that? The lesson was that when we looked behind us, we saw no one except us. We had left behind our parents, we had left behind the workers, we had left behind the civics, the rural communities, the women. And we realized we had made one fundamental mistake, that we had to go back and organize our people around the issues they felt were important. So where did I go? I went into the union movement, which was still illegal for African workers to join. And I went and organized outside the hostels. And I asked why. These hostels were like concentration camps. The most brutalized of workers were in these hostels. And they were the most illiterate, they were the most marginalized, but most importantly, had nothing to lose. And what I learned, because when I went there, I sort of went there with an analysis of the class struggle and how we were going to educate these people, and I learned that actually I had to shut my mouth and listen, because they had the solutions. And what I learned was the most important lesson in my life, that we've got to learn to listen if you want to become an activist. And you've got to work with people so that they find you co-create a vision with them. You co-create the tools that they need. And what I found in those first few years of organizing was that I knew every single thing that happened in any factory. And we were building an organization. It was a small union growing up. We had 5 factories organized. I knew every worker that was being disciplined, every disciplinary hearing. But then we found that actually we were building an organization. It wasn't a movement. So how do you build movements? It's when people understood that they had power. And that power was bringing a real value to them because they could not be arbitrarily dismissed. They could bargain for their wages. And anyone could be given those skills or build those skills that we built a movement. And so eventually, millions of people were joining us without us even going to the factory, because the workers who were organized and winning their own victories were organizing other workers. And that's how the movement was built. And sometimes I think we forget that. So I come back to the situation today. You know, in working with civil society, the evidence, the data is telling us that civic space is shrinking in the world. I mean, the Civicus report recently details 400 incidents of serious violations of civic space. The right to meet, the right to organize, the right to speak. And this is happening not just in the developing world. You take Canada as the industrialized country. Today, we know the Prime Minister of Canada has said that any organization challenging government on the tar sands project will have its funding cut. So across the board, we are seeing this idea of civic space shrinking, and people arguing that, in fact, economic growth will lift people out of poverty. Now, let's look at the evidence in Africa. We've had decades of successive economic growth that many of our leaders talk eloquently about, the progress in Africa. We're a continent which probably has a third of the mineral wealth of the world. We fuel the global economy. We have 2/3 of the remaining arable land in the world. We have water. We have natural resources. Our people are the poorest of any continent. Take any of the human development indicators. So if we're so rich under the ground, why are we so poor above the ground? It's about governance. So the question then is, all this economic growth, who has it benefited? Why is inequality rising? Why is poverty so persistent? Why is it the fact that the population of Africa today, which sits at 1 billion people, half of them under 19, and you find that that population has absolutely no stake in the system, feels excluded and marginalized. They're angry about their marginalization. They see no pathways for them out of their poverty. And so when we start talking about the extremism that happens, whether that's Al-Shabaab or whether it's Boko Haram, if you talk seriously to people and you say, well, why is there so much extremism? Well, you know, in a situation where your hope has been stolen, your dignity has been stolen, and the political or civil society leadership is so weak, and you see this huge wealth inequality, you put a gun into the hands of any young person and say, there's the enemy who you can see, and there will be violence. And that's an indictment on us, on our role as activists in development. Because we are not creating the tools or the mechanisms or the platforms that allow people to reclaim their dignity, to reclaim the hope that they have. But the interesting part of it, and I remember as minister in Mandela's cabinet of communications, that in 1996, we could look at sub-Saharan Africa, and there were 600,000 mobile phones. And we can say, well, what was the right of people to communications? There was no right. Today, there are 150 million mobile phones, the fastest growing market in the world. Young people are more connected today than they've ever been in the history of humankind. Technology has fundamentally changed the way we organize our lives, and we organize work, the way in which we access knowledge or information. And they've now been harnessing these platforms to, in fact, deliver services that they have. In Kenya today, 20% of the GDP of that country floats in something called M-Pesa. It's a mobile platform where people are able to send money to each other. They don't even have bank accounts. These are the poorest of the poor. They've understood that. So how do we understand that the world has changed from the time when I was the General Secretary of COSATU to today? These are opportunities. There are also lots of threats. But how do we understand combining the traditional ways of which we organize people with the fact that there's been a revolution in technology? And part of this revolution you begin to see in places like North Africa around the Arab Spring. Tremendous, huge upsurge of people on the streets that toppled the most powerful dictators in our continent. Not led by civil society. And they used technology to communicate with each other. But let's take Egypt as a classic example. We've had two revolutions that have fundamentally been stolen by the very people that organized themselves. What went wrong? That's the question we should be asking ourselves. Why were we not there to support them? I was in Cairo about 2 months after the Arab Spring. And it was fascinating that one can almost pinpoint what would have happened, of how we would disintegrate and your first revolution will be stolen because people that were more conservative, representing more conservative forces, but had absolute legitimate right to exist, were able to capture power. And part of that is the point that Liv is raising. It's the weakness of organizations of progressives, of civil society. And when there's a second upsurge that responds to that type of imposition of a very brutal and conservative agenda, it gets stolen again. So we've got to ask ourselves today, what's happening in the world? And I don't think there's any blueprints today. I think we're living in a world where there's a lot of gray. It's not as black and white as our fight against apartheid. I was asked recently to go to Swaziland as the chair of a global panel to investigate worker rights in Swaziland. Now, we do know that in Swaziland, we have the last remaining absolute monarch. It's an anomaly. This is a guy that has dreams that he spoke to God, and God told him to do this. But then uses the fiscus of Swaziland as his personal bank account. And where workers earn an average of $120 a month and have no union rights, he's deregistered the unions. And we've got to ask ourselves, why? These were very people that helped us fight and win our struggle for freedom. Why don't we have the solidarity? Why don't we get our government to take a stronger position against Swaziland or in Zimbabwe? And it comes back to the issue, is what power do we have as civil society to make sure that our leaders do the right thing? And it comes back to the issue of power and organization. So, I sort of, at the end of the day, get exhausted by our discussions that we have. And I think it does not pinpoint the weaknesses that we have. I was saying in an interview before this conference that, the vast majority of people in the world, 99% of the people, want a better society. They want a better world based on justice and human rights and dignity. We have 1% of the world that is bad, that seeks to accumulate wealth at the expense of others, that seeks to dominate society irrespective of the consequences, whether those are the issues related to the ecological boundaries that we have, whether it's about individual wealth and accumulation of wealth, whether that's about human rights or rule of law. Why do we let such a few people have such a powerful position that they can tell our governments what to do when we are the majority? And it comes back to the question, we are not organized. If you're not organized, your leaders, whether they're in unions, whether they are in civil society, whether they're in government, are going to respond to people who have more power. And they do have more power than us. And again, it's a reflection back to the notion that we are weak as a broad civil society movement. So I come back to that question. You know, in that meeting that I had around climate justice, we had representatives there like Sharon Burrows from the International Trade Union Congress. We had the head of the slum dwellers movement. We had the head of the indigenous network in the world. We had the heads of some of the big NGOs that are dealing, like Oil Watch International. There were a number of us. You know, it's the first time that we had met ourselves. So if you're starting to say we want to challenge the way the world works, then we've got to build this coalition of people who are committed to where we're wanting to go. So it comes back to the lessons of the anti-apartheid movement. Why did we succeed in our struggle? Because we built a coalition of people globally that defined apartheid and racial discrimination as a heresy. It was evil. It was bad. And then we created a momentum where individual citizens could take decisions that helped advance our struggle. So if you were in a supermarket, you would know this very well, and you had a choice of buying oranges produced in South Africa as produced in Argentina, you would not buy from South Africa. It gave you a chance to do something. If you were a trade unionist and you were working in the ports as a stevedore, you would make a decision, I will not offload the ship. So now what we've got to do is to then find that ability to do the same thing around the world that we want. So I think that if I go back to our lessons out of South Africa, what were those lessons? Fundamentally, towards the end of the 80s, we knew that we were at a political impasse. That at the end of the day, we would either have a war, and we'll end up with a scorched earth, or we'll have a political settlement. That was a choice. And so in the context of that choice, we knew that there had to be a political negotiation where leaders will arise on two sides of the conflict and say, how can we agree with each other on what we want to replace an impossible situation with? And that's what created the basis for this political miracle, which still remains a political miracle, that we were able to say, we choose not to go down this route, which is a racial civil war, and we've got to find each other. And in that process of transition, which is a very important part of describing democratic transition, something that I think in North Africa we failed to achieve, that the transition wasn't one big bang. It was a series of multiple transitions that laid the basis for where we went. So if you take the political transformation of South Africa, it took a decade from the time that Mandela was released to the time we had the Transitional Executive Committee, to the time we had the National Peace Accord that creates structures down to the ground, that created the ability for us to have free political activity, to having the elections in 1994, to having the new constitution in 1996, to finally having deracialization of local government elections in 2000. That was political transition, highly successful. And then we had to deal with the question of economic transformation, because at the end of the day, the political transformation must improve the quality of human well-being. So we went in as unions, equipped with the notion that we were all united against apartheid. What did we want to replace apartheid with? And we created a discussion around what became known as the Reconstruction and Development Program, which specified what is the outcomes that we wanted for people, and which at the end of the day said that the transformation had to put people at its center. The human development indices were the overriding factor of determining the success of the transition. And then we lost the battle. Because when we went into government, we assumed that we were all on the same page, and we found out, no, we were not on the same page. And what happened in that process, in the first 5 years, is that those human development indices were replaced by macroeconomic indices. And I'm not saying that the macroeconomic indices were not important. No one wants a bankrupt state, and we did have a bankrupt state. 93 cents in every rand was already committed to expenditure. So we had huge fiscal challenges that we had to deal with. We could not throw money at the problem, but we had to solve the problem, which was a structural problem. But there was a political battle around that, and the people that believed that growth will create the public goods won the battle. And so what happened is that instead of focusing on human well-being, we ended up saying our success is economic growth, as measured by GDP growth, and was about macroeconomic stability. And the two were two sides of one coin. And so we ended up in a situation today where the structural unemployment that we had during apartheid, that caused part of the crisis of apartheid, still exists. So what is the worrying signs that we have? So we have a situation where formal unemployment is 25%. That is people looking for jobs. So you start to say, well, why are we not creating these jobs? Well, if you go back to it, what are the inputs into creating economic growth or economic development? Well, it has to be about the skills. What I do know is that in 1994, the people who were born then went to school in 2000. There were close to 1.5 million people, young people who entered the schooling system. They came out in 2012. How many of them wrote the final grade 12 exams? About 700,000. How many passed? About 75%. So somewhere between what goes into the system, what comes out, we've lost more than 500,000. They haven't disappeared. And then the people that come out of these 12 years have very few skills, no jobs, and unlikely to have a job in their lifetime. Do you think they have a right to be angry? Absolutely, I would be angry. Because democracy hasn't delivered something meaningful to them. So we've got to look at the crisis in education. Similarly, we've got to look at the crisis in health. We've done really good because we have a good minister and we had a plan to deal with HIV/AIDS. But what was the stupidity that led us to be the epicenter of HIV/AIDS in the world? It was government policy and leadership. It was about governance. Governance failed. Governance still continues to fail us. Why does it fail us? South Africa is not a poor country. We're the wealthiest country in Africa. We are close to 30% of the economy of sub-Saharan Africa. So if you look at today, the 1.1 trillion rand that we have in our national budget, and I sit on a board of an organization called the Mo Ibrahim Foundation, very important organization, focused on governance, measuring the performance of the delivery of public goods. And while overall, albeit from a low base, governance has improved, there are some hugely worrying signs. We just issued the index last week. And what does it show? Economic growth has been great, but youth unemployment remains a huge, huge challenge. And what's going to happen with the demographics in Africa? So you're looking at a situation where projections into growth of population in Africa is going to hit 2 billion by 2050. By 2035, we have more people in our young people and the workforce in Africa than that of China or India. By 2050, we're 2 billion people. By the end of the century, half the young people in the world are African. So if we don't start dealing with this and making it a demographic dividend, which it is at the moment because we're the youngest population in the world, we have the richest resources in the world, and we've got to find a way to create the type of governance that makes sure that these people have a stake in the system, the political system, the economic system, the social system. If we do not do that, it will become our demographic nightmare. And not just ours, it will become yours as well. So I'm just saying is that if we start to think about these things, which are long-term trends, what we need to do and where do we place the issue of governance. If you look at South Africa, we have quadrupled the investment into public goods, but our performance across Africa has virtually not shifted at all. Less than 1 point out of 100 points. That's how our governance has improved. So what's happened in South Africa? Failure of education, failure of health, failure of municipal services. And what's that causing today? Why is that happening? Why is it happening? Because a lot of the middle classes, including the state officials and state public representatives, have opted out of the public system. They have private medical aid, they have private education, they even have generators in their homes, they drive 4x4 so they don't have to worry about potholes, they have private security. The public system, which is catering for the majority, is collapsing. And so poor people wanting services, they go and I want my garbage cleared, I want electricity, I want water in my taps. And there's nothing. So they find that they cannot talk to someone who can take this issue up because the leaders are so discredited. Nothing ever changes in their lives. What do? When they're not organized and they're not getting what they're entitled to in terms of the Constitution, they'll burn down something. It sometimes happens to be a school or a library or a public building. Violence becomes a language. And we've got to understand the psychological impact of that. And that's why it's so important that we focus on that. So what have we got to bring into this equation? Issues of corruption that are rising. And corruption, there's big corruption, which people talk about and they lose sight of what is this figure you're spending, billion rand stolen or whatever. But when corruption at a local level means there's no medicines in the hospital and babies die like they did in the Eastern Cape because there's no vaccines, there's no incubators, and there's no electricity, that's when people have a right to become angry. And so in that context, what happens? The big organizations, like the COSATUs of the world, are not focused down there. They focus on the big issues of politics. Who's going to be in the next government? Who's going to be in the next governing party? The ANC. And even in the unions, workers lose confidence in their leaders. So you have a Marikana massacre that takes place. A devastating indictment on all of us. It's a massacre. And no matter what commission you appoint, you will never deal with the root causes of that. A failure of leadership. A failure of organization. And so we're going to blame miners, or we'll blame the police, but we won't blame the leadership problems and the fact that we're not as organized as we used to for what's happened there. And these are the issues I think that really we should bring under the spotlight. And they're worrying signs. But out of that great adversity are some good news stories. Because I am not sentimental about organizations. I think they come and they go. What I am keen about is that how do we empower people to have the skills, the tools to change their lives. Because people will always be there. Organizations come and go, governments come and go, political parties come and go. What is it do we need about citizens? Because at the heart of what we fought for and that's enshrined in our Constitution is the idea of justice, social justice, human dignity. And that's interesting about South Africa today. It's back to being a laboratory. And I'm actually optimistic about it. Because if I look at what changed government policy on HIV/AIDS, it had nothing to do with academics or scientists or politicians. It had to do with the fact that people were so offended by this that they went out there and they organized themselves into the Treatment Action Committee and they took government to court and they mobilized the society around the human right of people to ARVs. And today, 1.5 million people have rights to ARVs. They brought down the president. If I look at today some of the of the victories that we're having in South Africa, whether it's a victory around the right of children to textbooks. Let's take education. We spend $20 billion a year on education. It's not an issue of money there. It's more than the budgets of most countries in Africa. Our outcomes are worse than Botswana or Zimbabwe or Kenya. So it's about how do we improve performance of the state. How do we get these leaders that we have to know that they are there to do a job and we want them to do the job? It has nothing to do with ideology. Do your damn job. You know, I fired people as General Secretary of COSATU for stealing a T-shirt. Today in the Eastern Cape, the government investigates the Eastern Cape health crisis, which killed babies, and found that 800 million rand, $100 million has been stolen. Not one person has gone to jail. That's what we need to do, is bring ethics back into governance. And so I'm sort of optimistic. Today, the Minister of Health was empowered to say he's going to overrule the health system in the Eastern Cape, and he's building the hospitals. He's going to make sure that there are medicines and vaccines and antibiotics in the clinics. And that's because people stood up. And more of that is starting to happen. And I think that's very positive. So where does this lead us to? Well, we're going into an election in next year. And it's a very interesting scenario, because suddenly there's been many people were standing up and saying, some of them completely opportunist or populist or chauvinists, but they're saying, listen, we have a right to go and campaign for the type of politics we believe in. And so we're going to have a greater degree of political pluralism, which I think is good for democracy. I think we're going to have an increasing discussion in the society about the rights of citizens and their entitlements. There's the emergence of a social justice coalition that is coming up, which is bringing together the very disparate groups of organizations, including some unions, including NGOs, including academics who are speaking out very strongly about what their rights are. That's positive. And we're starting to have people even within government that are responding to that. I think Liv is just coming back from hosting a sort of discussion on delivery and development between government and unions and NGOs and business. I think these are really great innovations. We're coming back to the thing of what is the meaning of democracy. And that, I think, is positive. We're having an increasingly more robust media, and the technology is allowing people to participate in public debate, even if people want to make the public broadcaster back to being a state broadcaster. So I think in that mixture, South Africa re-emerges as a laboratory. And I think it serves as an important indicator for what will start happen in the rest of Africa. And I think that's a very fascinating situation to be in. I think people like me play a role in saying, well, we can provide the aerial cover, but it's the next generation now that must decide what they stand for. What is the world they want? What is the country they want? What is the democracy they want? And we cannot afford them to be leaders of tomorrow. We need them to be leaders of today. And what we have to bring back into the core of our discourse, both at a country level, at a local level, and a global level, is a notion of justice, rights, and dignity. And what I see increasingly with big civil society at a global level, they are more interested in attending meetings where they get like 2 minutes to make a comment in the Millennium Development Goals discourse or the UNFCCC, a lot of these acronyms that I don't even know what they mean, but are completely disconnected from what people are at the ground. So part of the discussion I'm having with unions and civil society, progressive businesses, academics is saying, what is the new global narrative we need that is about globalizing local voices, bringing our real strength that we are the majority in the world, and those voices have to constitute the core of the world that we want. So we're not held hostage by vested interests that dominate the global discussion today, which says justice is irrelevant, or idea of rights should not be brought into the discussion. And this is where, particularly in Scandinavia, you're very important. I spoke in the Swedish Parliament yesterday to a multi-party civil society discussion on Swedish development policy and said, do not be intimidated by the superpowers who say that if you bring rights or you bring justice into the discussions on the MDGs or in the discussions around climate, that you will destroy the talks. I think we cannot be held hostage any longer to a small minority of people today that wield enormous power because of their financial power and their financial resources. We need a new narrative driven from the ground that takes us back to the world that we want and the world that we want to leave our children. So let me stop at that. Otherwise, I could continue for a long time, and I think we need to have a conversation about it. Thank you.